Hello and welcome back in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. It is week 9 of the fantasy season. And as you can see, Alvin Kamara, the top fantasy guy from this past week, had himself a huge game. We'll get to that in a minute. But good news for me at least. First week of the fantasy season where I won every single game. So we're back on track. I'm on a 2-game win streak in my league that I run, in my buddy's league, and finally picked up another win in my work league. So don't call it a comeback yet, but possibly could be getting there. That's why we don't give up. That's why we continue to stay diligent throughout the fantasy season. You never know when you can turn it around. Hopefully, we continue this into next week. But going into week 9, there are a few buys. You won't have Cleveland, so no Amari Cooper, no Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt if you're playing that guy. None of those guys will be in. Denver doesn't really affect you unless you maybe play their defense. Dallas, you won't have Tony Pollard, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz is another guy that you won't have as well. The Giants, no Saquon. Got to figure that out. Pittsburgh, whatever weapons you may use from Pittsburgh. Maybe you're actually a little happy that Pittsburgh isn't playing this week because then you don't have to make decisions on like George Pickens, guys like that. And then San Francisco. No Christian McCaffrey, no Debo, no Brandon Ayuk, no George Kittle. So quite a few big guys out this week. So again, like I've been saying since the bye week started, hopefully you planned for that. Hopefully you have some viable backups to cover for this next week. All right, but let's get back into week 8. We're halfway through the dang fantasy season now, so let's get into week 8's heroes, villains, and good Samaritans. We'll start with all of the heroes at the quarterback position. Last week, I was high on Tua. We didn't get to do the show with Dylan Corbett, but I did take Tua in my DFS lineup. He had 382 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 19 rushing yards as well, giving himself 29.18 fantasy points. Big day for him. Hopefully, we continue that throughout the rest of this year. Then you had Jalen Hurts. He had 285 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, which Jalen Hurts getting more passing touchdowns than anything else. Kind of a good thing to see. You know what he can do on the ground. Now he's starting to do a lot in the air as well. So he also had 10 rushing yards. He had 28.4 fantasy points. Those are your top 2 quarterbacks for this week. At the running back position, you saw him at the beginning of the show. Alvin Kamara, where have you been all season, sir? He had 62 rush yards, a touchdown on the ground, 9 catches for 96 yards through the air, and 2 receiving touchdowns, giving him 42.8 fantasy points. You love to see it. If you had Alvin Kamara on your team, he finally paid off this week. Huge game for him. And then, speaking of Christian McCaffrey and the 49ers, him being out this week, he might have found himself a great new home in San Francisco. He had 94 rushing yards, a touchdown on the ground. He had 8 catches for 55 yards and a touchdown through the receiving. He even had 34 passing yards and a touchdown through the air, throwing the football. He had 3 total touchdowns in every facet of the offense. He had 40.26 fantasy points. Is he possibly even more dangerous in San Francisco? You know, it was a slow first week. Kind of had to get used to it. Holy crap. They really worked him in this week, and he had himself a huge game. At the wide receiver position, a guy that was on my love list last week, I believe. Let's take a look back. Quick look back. Okay, he was on my starts list. Wasn't in my loves list, but was on my starts list. A.J. Brown, big game for him. I saw it coming. Thought it was a great matchup. Ended up being that way. I didn't expect him to get 3 receiving touchdowns, though. He had 6 catches, 156 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. I thought Devontae Smith maybe would get some sort of involvement in this game because it was such a good matchup, but it all went to A.J. Brown. He had 39.6 fantasy points. And then DeAndre Hopkins, once again, thank God I had this guy on my bench all season, waiting for him to come back because he had 12 catches, 159 yards, and a touchdown. That is 22 catches in the last 2 weeks since he's been back. Love to see that. Then at the tight end position, a guy that kind of pissed me off that he had a good week because I dropped him a while ago. Tyler Conklin for the Jets had 6 catches, 79 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 25.9 fantasy points. All in a losing effort as well. So I don't know what to think of the Jets, any of their weapons. It's all over the place. And then Isaiah Likely, I believe he plays for Baltimore. He had 6 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown for 19.7 fantasy points. Mark Andrews dealing with stuff. I believe it's a shoulder, it's an ankle, wasn't super involved this week. Isaiah Likely apparently is just a worthwhile backup if you need to maybe shift some things around Mark Andrews. Then we get into the villains. I hate to put this guy in the villains category because it was his debut, but it wasn't good. It just was not good. Malik Willis made his first start for the Tennessee Titans, only had 55 passing yards, an interception, and 12 rushing yards. The guy had 1.2 or 1.4 fantasy points. That's tough. That's not going to get the job done at all. Hopefully you didn't just buy into the hype immediately and try to play him this week because you had a rough time. And then Derek Carr. It was damn near just as bad. He had 101 passing yards, an interception, and -1 rushing yard for 1.94 fantasy points. Ouch. Not what we expected to see at all from Derek Carr at any point in this season when, we saw Devontae Adams going there. Tough game for the Raiders. Then at the running back position, a guy who's been here far too much, especially for being the pretty much consensus number 1 pick in fantasy. Jonathan Taylor had 76 rush yards for 5.6 fantasy points. And then a guy who kind of broke my heart a little this week, Josh Jacobs. He had 3 straight weeks of 30 points or more. This week, it was just a tough week against the Saints. Maybe the Saints defense is really legit. Josh Jacobs, he had 43 rush yards, 2 receptions for 11 receiving yards, 7.4 fantasy points. Wasn't a huge dud, but it was a dud nonetheless, sitting there under 10 points when you were expecting, hopefully, somewhere around 30, because that's where he's been getting. Then our receiver position. I just talked about A.J. Brown and how I thought Devontae Smith would get into the work as well, but he didn't, and he lands himself in the villain spot with 5 catches, 23 yards, only 7.3 fantasy points. And then another guy who I've been preaching, I love this guy, I love this guy, I love this guy. I didn't love him this week, okay? George Pickens, he had 3 targets, but failed to record any fantasy points. Yeah. And I believe I had him sitting in one of my lineups. That's tough, but hey, I still got the win, so it's okay. Pickens, I can forgive you. If I lost in that league this week, I would have a very hard time forgiving you, but I can forgive you this week for not getting a single point. And then at the tight end, I've only got one. It was Mark Andrews, 3 catches, 33 yards, 6.3 fantasy points. Again, he's dealing with injuries. It's tough. Hopefully, he gets through them and gets back on the field and continues to be that top guy. But last week definitely hurt you having him in your lineup. And then the Good Samaritans. Normally I put down some quarterbacks, some running backs, some wide receivers. This week, I'm just putting down all the guys who scored 30 points because there was quite a few. We had all of the guys in heroes who had 29, 28, 42, 40, 39, 33, but there's still a bunch of guys that scored 30 points or more this week. Derrick Henry, how about that? I believe he was my love candidate last week for the running back position. He didn't disappoint. 219 rush yards, 2 touchdowns, and a catch for 9 yards, giving him 35.8 fantasy points. I knew he was going to feast against Houston. Everybody does. He looked absolutely unstoppable. And believe it or not, Tennessee only won that game like 17-10 or something like that. And it was all Derrick Henry. They didn't do anything else through the air. Obviously, we just talked about Malik Willis having such a terrible game. All he had to do was turn around and hand the ball to Derrick Henry, and that got the job done. And then Tony Pollard, one guy who I decided to play over Jonathan Taylor this week. Risky move, it paid off. Big game for him without Zeke Elliott in the backfield. He had 131 rush yards, 3 touchdowns, and a reception for 16 yards, giving him 33.7 fantasy points. Probably the hottest waiver wire pickup of last week gets up on the board here as well. Deontay Foreman, 118 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. He had 31.8 fantasy points. And then the dynamic duo for the Miami Dolphins. Honestly, these two guys could be in the top 10 with each other all year. It's crazy. You have Tyreek Hill had 12 catches, 188 yards, and 7 rushing yards. No touchdowns, but still got himself 31.5 fantasy points. And the reason he didn't get touchdowns is because Jalen Waddle was stealing all of them. He had 8 catches, 106 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 30.6 fantasy points. All right. That's everything from last week. Let's get into week 9. This is, you can consider week 8 or week 9 the halfway point. We're going to consider next week the halfway point so we can do something with the show. But we're right here, dead center in the middle. Fantasy season, you've got, let's see, you got week 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, maybe 14. So you got about 6 games left before you got to make a playoff run. Maybe even 5, depending on where your fantasy team or fantasy league goes. You either got 5 or 6 games left to get to those playoffs. For me, I can't lose a single game, so it's got to be full steam ahead. Let's get into starts and sits. At the quarterback position, let's start Geno Smith again. Okay, I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse almost every week. I've got Geno Smith somewhere in the show. Why wouldn't you? He has been so good. I mean, he hasn't been breaking the league, but he's been so good over over the course of this season. It's hard not to start him. And he's going up against Arizona, who's 27th against the quarterback position, who just gave up the quarterback 6 last week. They just gave up quarterback 6. They give up an average of 23 fantasy points per game. And they've given up 2 20-point performances, a 30-point performance, a 40-point performance. Yes, throw Geno in there. He's gonna play for you. He's gonna do a great job. And you know, this Geno and the Seahawks are why it's so hard to pick any Seahawks game, because you don't want to choose them. You don't think they should win, but they do, or they're close. And the Cardinals now, I mean, their defense, it's pretty decent. Did pretty good the last couple of weeks. But Geno Smith, this offense, he also has some great running attack behind him. So I think it's a great week for Geno Smith against Arizona. And then, dicey. This one's going to be dicey. We're going with Trevor Lawrence, but he's going up against Vegas, who's 32nd against the quarterback position. So, yes, Lawrence hasn't really performed in the top echelon of quarterbacks since the first couple weeks of the season, but I think this week is going to be a great week going up against Vegas. They give up an average of 26 points per game. 6 of the 7 games this season, they've given up a top 10 quarterback. And they've given up in 3 top 5 quarterbacks in 3 quarterback eights. So 6 top 10 performances out of 7 games, and 3 of those have been top 5 performances. So if there was any week for Trevor Lawrence as a fantasy quarterback to get on track, it'd be this week against the Raiders. Sit quarterbacks. These guys I don't like this week. We're going with Jared Goff going up against Green Bay, who is 6th against the quarterback position, and Zach Wilson going up against Buffalo, who is 3rd against the quarterback position. So for Jared Goff, Green Bay, they only give up 13.5 fantasy points per game. They've given up 2 20-point performances, but every other performance has been 20 points or less. And that's only like 2 games that have been over 15. So they're very stout when it comes to defending fantasy quarterbacks. Jared Goff has had a couple of pretty good weeks where, he gives you a better week than you expected. That's not going to be this week. It's not going up against Green Bay, who did pretty decent against Josh Allen. I know Josh Allen had a decent game. The Bills won, but they did force 2 turnovers. They forced Josh Allen to throw 2 interceptions. So Jared Goff, I'm sorry, guy. I'm sorry, but you're not that guy. That's where we're at with this against Green Bay. And then let's get to Zach Wilson. He's going up against Buffalo. They're 3rd against the quarterback position. As good as Green Bay is against quarterbacks, Buffalo's even better. They give up an average of 11.5 points per game. They've only given up 1 20-point performance. 5 other performances so far this year, and I believe they're sitting at 7 games. So 5 of 7 games, they've given up less than 10 points per game to a quarterback. In one of those weeks, they gave up -1 point to the quarterback position. Zach Wilson's been struggling. He struggled last week doing just a lot of rookie-type mistake things. So this week, I honestly could see another negative week for the Buffalo Bills defense to a quarterback. Then at your running back position, let's go with Miles Sanders. We just saw in week 6, who went off against Houston in week 6? Josh Jacobs. Week 7, and then week 8 last week, Derrick Henry goes off against Houston. Now it's Miles Sanders' turn, I think. I don't know how he's gonna do it, but he's had some good games this season anyway. But for Houston, they give up 27 points per game. They've given up 5 top 5 performances, with 2 of those being the running back 1 and 2 of those being the running back 2. They've given up in the last 2 weeks 72.5 fantasy points, and that's just in the last 2 weeks. So I don't know how Miles Sanders is going to do it. I don't know in what facet he's going to get these points, but he's going to get these points. And if it's running for 150 yards and a couple catches and maybe a touchdown, I don't know how it's going to be, but he'll be somewhere within the top 10 this week. I would venture to say top 5, but we're going to play it safe and just say he's going to be in the top 10 going up against Houston. And then this one's dicey, but I'm kind of on the stroke of play whatever running back is going up against the Chargers. So we're going with Tyler Algier this week against the Chargers, who are 31st against the running back position. They've given up 4 top 10 performances, 2 of those inside the top 5. And then in week 7, they gave up the running back 3. They didn't play last week, so in their most recent game, they gave up the running back 3. They give up 128 rush yards per game and a touchdown. That all comes out to about 22.5 fantasy points. We've seen Algier have some relevant games so far this year, and going up against the Chargers, that's a juicy matchup. So I think he's going to find himself somewhere in the top 10 as well. Sit candidates for the running back position, Jonathan Taylor. We're just going to continue to sit him until we know what the Colts offense is doing, until we see anything out of him. And this week, a tough matchup. going up against New England. They're second against the running back position. They've only given up 2 touchdowns, 1 rushing and 1 receiving, 12 points a game, 6 performances. They've given up less than 100 rush yards. And Jonathan Taylor has 3 single-digit games, one of those being last week with 5.6 points. So, again, it's a tough matchup. Until we see anything different out of the Colts offense, it's going to be tough to start him. Like I said, I had to choose between Tony Pollard and Jonathan Taylor this past week. I went with Tony Pollard. It worked out very well, thank goodness, but it's just tough to play Jonathan Taylor right now. And then the other running back, we're going to sit Dameon Pierce. This one, it's not necessarily that I don't trust Dameon Pierce going up against Philly because they are 20th against the running back position, but it's more of just what the game script's going to be. I think Philly's going to get up on these guys very quickly, and then they're going to have to be throwing the football. So where does Dameon Pierce work into that? Maybe he gets a few catches. Maybe he gets somewhere in the 10-point range, but it's going to be really hard unless he breaks off something huge to be a big fantasy guy this week. You know, maybe at the beginning of the game, he breaks off something big and supplements a fantasy game that way. But it just looking at it, I think Philly's going to be up. It's going to force Houston to try to throw the ball the entire game. And then I don't see, I'm not picturing where Dameon Pierce could be in that, in the mix of that. At the wide receiver position, let's go with T. Higgins for a starter, going up against Carolina, who is 23rd against the wide receiver position. They've given up 2 top 10 performances. They give up 20.5 points a game, which translates to 155 yards. No Jamar Chase. Yes, I know they just got their asses kind of kicked last night on Monday Night Football against Cleveland. Of course they did, because I chose them, and I can't choose anything right on Monday nights, but I think they turn it around this week. I think it's going to be okay, and I think T. Higgins is going to be the biggest beneficiary of Jamar Chase being on and them having a bounce back week. And then we've got Terry McLaurin going up against Minnesota. How about we get excited for scary freaking Terry? He's starting to come back. Going up against Minnesota, who gives up 22.5 points per game to the receiver position, 200 receiving yards, and they've given up 2 top 10 performances. When I say Terry McLaurin is back, he's been there the whole season. But with Taylor Heineke, the past 2 games, he's had 8 targets per game, 18 points and 16 points. And this past performance could have been more than 16 had he been able to fall forward for 1 more yard to get a touchdown. So just some incredible last 2 games from him, and I think it continues. I think if Washington's smart, just don't play Carson Wentz no matter if he's ready or not. Just keep Taylor Heineke in. Your offense is doing better. You're winning games. You've won the past 2 with Taylor Heineke. Keep it going. And Minnesota, yeah, they are, what are they, 6-7-1 now? But they're always that team that you got a chance against them. And if you hang in for the whole game, like Washington can, there's a good chance that we could see an upset there, and we could see Terry McLaurin be a huge part of that. Sit candidates for the receiver position, DJ Moore. He was on the other side of this list last week, but this week he's going up against Cincinnati. And yeah, they've given up 2 top 10 performances, but Moore, he's very inconsistent. He only averages about 12 points per game. He's had, I think, the last 2 weeks, he's had pretty good performances, but I don't like the matchup going up against Cincinnati in a game where I think it's going to be kind of like a get-right game for Cincinnati. You know, I could be completely wrong. DJ Moore could go out there and get, 10 catches and be somewhere in the top 15, but I just think it's going to be a tough week, especially trying to bounce back from the loss last week. And then Devontae Smith, again, it's not that I don't like Devontae Smith, but he's going up against Houston, who is 5th against receivers, which that's a tough matchup as is. Houston's defense only gives up about 16 points to wide receivers per game. The only problem with all of this is Smith is the second option to A.J. Brown, and that was extremely clear last week when you had A.J. Brown be one of the top fantasy wide receivers and Devontae Smith be one of the bottom. They can't supplement each other like a Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So I just think it's already going to be a tough matchup receiver-wise, and Devontae Smith being that second option could find himself, kind of scraping the bottom again. Then at the receiver or the tight end position, only one for each of these. Zach Ertz going up against Seattle. They are 32nd against the tight end position, and he is the tight end 3 so far this year. Seattle gives 15 points per game to tight ends. I just think it's going to be a great game for Zach Ertz. I think there will be plenty of passing to go around. Hopefully, Arizona doesn't, kind of have a stale game like they did last week where you just are kind of wondering when the fantasy points are going to come. I think this week, there's going to be plenty of points to be had with them and Seattle. So I think Zach Ertz benefits out of that. And then let's just sit Mark Andrews this week. Yeah, I'm saying it. I mean, he's going up against New Orleans, and I always say don't play your tight ends against New Orleans. Normally, Mark Andrews would be an exception to that, but we saw last week he's just having some issues with those injuries. Only had 6.3 fantasy points. Isaiah Likely came in and had himself the tight end 2 days. So, I mean, let's just sit him this week. Hopefully, Baltimore sits him, and then that's just an obvious sit, but hopefully he just kind of gets everything back to right and comes back healthier than ever. All right, so let's hop into the love-hate list before we get out of here. My love quarterback this week, Justin Herbert, going up against Atlanta, who is 31st against the quarterback position. Herbert, he's got 3 weeks, less than 20 points, but he's coming off a bye. He's got that rest. Let's get a good matchup in here, and he does with the 31st ranked Atlanta defense against quarterbacks. They allow 300 yards a game, 2 passing touchdowns. They average less than 1 interception per game. They've given up 5 20-point performances and a 40-point performance, giving up an average of 22.75 fantasy points. So all of this, Justin Herbert needs a bounce-back game. This is exactly the team to do it against, and I think it's going to be a huge week for Justin Herbert. Who's my hate quarterback? That's going to be Tom Brady going up against the Rams, who only give up 15.29 fantasy points per game, 214 yards, as well as a touchdown. But as bad as the Rams look, they've only given up one big-time performance, one top 10 performance, and that was to Josh Allen in week 1. Since then, it's been tough sledding, and Tom Brady is already on a tough ride this season, regardless of his stuff going outside of football. On the football field, it's been a rough year for him, so I don't like it going up against the Rams. It's just a tough matchup. At the running back position, let's go with Travis Etienne this week. No more James Robinson. It's just him. Last week was his first week, just him. And boy, did he deliver. He had 156 rush yards and a touchdown, giving him 25.2 fantasy points in the running back 7 week. Now this week, going up against Vegas, who's 25th against running backs, they just gave up 62 rush yards, 92 rush yards, 9 receptions, 2 touchdowns to Alvin Kamara last week, who was the running back 1, nearly 45 fantasy points. So I think Travis Etienne, it's going to be a good matchup for him. Trevor Lawrence is on my starts list. I mean, I just think this offense is going to have themselves a good game. I think Travis Etienne continues to build off of last week and kind of makes a run at being one of those top running backs this season. At the running back position that I hate, Clyde Edwards-Helaire going up against Tennessee. They are 9th against the running back position. Clyde, he has 3 straight games of less than 10 points. He started out super consistent, and he's nosedived. It's not. I mean, we yeah, you don't know what to do with the backfield for the Chiefs because he can be involved. One of those games under 10 points, he still scored a touchdown. What if he adds just a little bit to that and gets up to 15? It's tough, but this is going to be a rougher matchup for himself. And I'm not saying that the Chiefs are going to have a tough time. I just think Clyde himself may have a tough time going into this week. Love candidate for the receiver position. It's a super obvious one, but we're going with it. Justin Jefferson going up against Washington, who is 24th against the receiver position. Jay Jettas is averaging 21 points a game. He's had 3 30-point performances, and only twice has he been under 15 points. If your like absolute floor is sitting at 15 points, that's huge. And we already know your ceiling somewhere in the 30-point range. I love that this week going up against Washington, who gives up 23 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver, and they've given up 4 top 10 performances, 2 of those inside the top 5. It's going to be a huge week for Justin Jefferson. Terry McLaurin, I said I like him on the other side. Love Justin Jefferson going into this week. Who do I hate for the receivers? Got to go with Amon-Ra St. Brown this week going up against Green Bay. St. Brown has been under 15 points since week 2. He had 2 huge weeks and hasn't really done much since. Green Bay, they're 8th against the receiver position. And I would just like to sit here and say, for all of you who would not trade Amon-Ra St. Brown to me, you've gotten stuck with under 15 points a week. Not me. And it's kind of worked out for me. So thanks for that, guys. Thanks for dodging the bullet for me. But yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been a tough season. He's been dealing with injuries this week. It's going to be tough going up against Green Bay. So that's who we're going with for the receiver position. And then at the tight end position, I love Gerald Everett. Normally, I don't like to have people on the same teams within the love list or the star list and all of that, unless it's, a quarterback and a receiver. Well, here it's a quarterback and his tight end. Everett going up against Atlanta, who is 29th against the tight end position. They've given up 3 top 5 performances, 2 other top 10 performances, and Gerald Everett, he's got 4 games over 10 points. You're like, okay, that's not a lot of points. Well, for your tight end position, anything over 10 points is solid. And this week, I think he's got a chance to get even more, higher than 10 points. I think he could probably get somewhere in the 15, maybe even to the 20-point range, depending on who's in, who's out for the Chargers receiver-wise. So I think it's a great game for Gerald Everett. Love him this week. And at the tight end position for our hate, we're going to go with Mike Gesicki going up against Chicago, who is 8th against the tight end position. Gesicki, you never know what to expect from him. He's up and he's down. He's up and he's down. He had a decent week this past week, but he caught a touchdown. Had it not been for that, he'd have been probably somewhere under 10 points. Chicago themselves, they give up 4.5 points per game to the tight end position, and they've only given up 2 touchdowns. Again, I don't think it's going to be a super duper tough game for Miami, but Chicago's shown they can compete. They may shut down Mike Gesicki. I don't think they're going to shut down Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. So a lot of points to be had in that game for them, but Mike Gesicki, I think it's going to be tough. So he's got to be my hate player of the week. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for sitting here with me, listening to me roll my mouth. Got this new on-air sign from my now fiance, so that's awesome. It looks real good back there. Saw one in the store and told her I was like, oh, it'd be cool to have an on-air sign, so she went and got one for me as our anniversary / I guess engagement gift. So that is it for today. Don't quote me on it, but we should have lucky bets in tomorrow. Just some scheduling stuff last week that didn't work out, but we hopefully will have Dylan Corbett on the show tomorrow with us. And then on Thursday, before we get to Thursday Night Football, we will have the Game Day show. So tune in for those. Thanks for watching today. Make sure to like, subscribe, yada yada. Go follow the socials, all of that stuff. And we will see you tomorrow.